This Advent, we have been journeying through the spirituals with Dr. Luke Powery. At the end of each day in that devotional is a prayer, and I wanted to read the one to you that's written on the front of your bulletin this week. Delivering God, free me to be all that you want me to be. Amen. Our second scripture is from the 35th chapter of the book of Isaiah. Listen to the word of the Lord as it speaks to us today. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands, make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For waters shall break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, the water, thirsty ground, springs of water. The haunt of jackals shall become a swamp, the grass shall become reeds and rushes. A highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. The unclean shall not travel on it, but it shall be for God's people. No traveler, not even fool, shall go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there. But the redeemed shall walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Friends, this is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. I remember the color of our carpet in our middle school gathering area that we called the niche. I remember it was just before third period, my least favorite, math, with grouchy and difficult Mr. Kuhlman, who would carry around a red pen in his ear like he was going to mark up everything you had ever written. I remember walking into a room full of people glued to a small television set, which was confusing because we weren't supposed to have the TV on unless we were watching something educational during class. I remember the tears of adult teachers around me as my 13-year-old self saw the two towers burning, crashing, and falling. Those of us old enough to remember that day remember it with sharp exactness. Maybe you remember what you were wearing, what the weather was like outside. So much loss. Loss of life, loss of the feeling of security, loss of the idea that we were untouchable, invulnerable. History will forever bear the mark of that day, as we will. So much so that we will forever talk about pre-9/11 and post-9/11. It was not only the destruction of human life that terrorized us, though. Those jets crashed into the World Trade Centers, hubs of economic flourishing, symbols of people across the world working together, World Trade Centers. Those towers blanketed our most famous city, New York, with dust and ash for miles. The walls of our military intelligence fortress, the Pentagon, were breached. And the last plane, if not for the courage of the members of Flight 93, was headed for our political center, our political heart, the White House or the Capitol building. That day, it was like an arrow was shot through the heart of our nation. Everyone felt it. 2,600 years before that fateful September day, the people of Judah experienced their own 9/11. The Babylonian army, ancestors of those who flew the planes on 9/11, marched into Israel's most famous city, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the political and economic and religious capital center of the world. As the Babylonians marched in, they went first to the palace of the king and burned it to the ground. They second went to Jerusalem's heart, to its very soul, to the temple, the place where Jews believed God's presence most prominently resided in the entire world, to the nucleus of their life. The temple set to fire, and ash and dust covered the Jerusalem streets. That day, brothers and daughters and mothers and sons and women and children were separated from one another, some killed. Thousands were marched away from Jerusalem, leaving behind them the only home that they had known for 500 years. The road to Babylon was long and arduous. 900 miles they would march through the desert, dry land. Imagine walking through August's southern heat from Salisbury to New Orleans with nothing but the clothes on your back. And you begin to get the idea of what they went through. When they arrived in that foreign land, Babylon, strange to their eyes, their almighty king was paraded through the Babylon streets with hooks through his skin. He was spit on and embarrassed. And for 40 years, an entire generation's worth of time and history, the people of Israel were POWs. They were prisoners of war, slaves, far from home, in a place that they did not know. The name for this experience of devastation and destruction, dismantling of all that they knew and held most dear is exile. Say exile. Exile. In 587 BCE, Israel went into exile, to Babylonian captivity. Nothing shapes our Old Testament story, the story of our Bible, and the existence of Jews across the world more than this event. Babylonian exile. Every word that the prophet Isaiah uttered, every syllable he spoke, concerned with the experience of the Israelites in exile. It is to exile today that we go with Isaiah. As I was pondering exile with Isaiah this week, I came across a famous singing group. Many of you probably have heard them, Pentatonics. Oh, there we go. All right. A group of young singers who take old familiar tunes and reprise them using many part harmonies, creative music videos, a clever reimagining of old familiar tunes. It's a great group. They do this with different Christmas hymns also. So this time of year, the Pentatonics can be a delight to listen to. Recently, they reprised one of my favorites, an oldie but a goodie, Joy to the World. We'll sing Joy to the World today. Maybe you remember the lyrics of that great hymn. Joy to the world, the Lord is come, let earth receive her King. And the next verse, joy to the world, the Savior rings. And another, he rules the world with truth and grace. Great words, great lyrics. As I listened, though, something felt off. Something felt amiss. I looked up the original lyrics to Joy to the World as I listened to the song, and I discovered that the Pentatonics, beautiful singers though that they are, had lopped off the entire third verse of Joy to the World. No more let sin and sorrows grow, nor thorns infest the ground. He comes to make his blessings flow far as the curse is found. Far as the curse is found. For whatever reason, the modernized version of the old hymn wanted joy without the mention of its opposite: sorrow, sin, thorn, curse. That's sort of like what the holidays have become in our world. There are the lights and the gifts and the funny Christmas movie classics that we all adore, and the feasts and the parades and the holiday cheer and the very ugly Christmas sweaters, all good, all wonderful. We want joy to the world, and we all deserve joy to the world this season, but we don't want to look at the sorrow and sin that is playing beneath the notes. We don't want to take notice of it. We'd like to delete that verse of our existence. We humans, we are so good at hiding. I think about this many Sundays as our youth ask me continually if we can play hide and go seek yet again in the dark sanctuary. We are good at hiding. Ever since the Garden of Eden, where sorrow and sin and thistle and curse first entered our world, we hid from God. Adam and Eve's first response to the brokenness of the garden is to hide from God as God walks all the way through the garden. I wonder if this is the reason why so many of us haven't heard this despairing verse in the Bible called exile, because we'd rather hide from it. We'd rather hide from exile because it's not just something that happened in the Bible a long time ago. Exile is our place. Exile is our condition. It is the place that we so often live. Exile is the state of our heart. Exile. We know exile. We try to hide from it as much as we can. We try to numb ourselves from it, but we are far too glued to our iPhones and television sets to be able to ignore that our society lives in Babylon. Daily lives in Babylon. In the last 10 years, the suicide rate in our country has increased 30%. Exile. When polled, 70% of people in our country said they worry that we don't know how to treat one another anymore, and they're not sure what our future will look like. Exile. This year alone, there's been 395 mass shootings in schools, army bases, synagogues, churches, and on city streets. Exile. While it would take $3 billion a year to feed the majority world's 66 million hungry children, Americans spend $5 billion on Black Friday alone. Exile. In our city, in our beloved Salisbury, 22% of people live below the poverty line, 10% above the national average. And the three groups most affected: women ages 25 to 31, ages 35 to 45, and sadly, young girls ages 6 to 11. Exile. Exile. But exile isn't just out there in the world, beyond these walls in which we find ourselves this morning. It would be easy to dismiss the world and our city's problems when we live securely in Jerusalem, as we often do. We do a good job of hiding it, but we live in Babylon too. Exile is deeply personal. It hits close to home for each of us. You know what exile is like. Many of us brought exile into the church with us this morning. It is that feeling of being lost, of not knowing where you are going or where you are, who you are anymore. Exile is the deep-seated conflict that happens with those that we are closest to, our families, our spouses, children, our parents, our friends. Exile is the declining health of a loved one or yourself. It is a new diagnosis or the carrying out of an old one. It is the fear of losing someone or something you love most in the world. Exile is the deep loneliness, depression, and anxiety that many of us feel. Exile is the shame that we carry, the guilt over things that we said or did not say, over things that we cannot take back, moments that we cannot relive. Exile is the self-hatred that we just cannot let go of, the addiction that we cannot shake, a season of faithlessness and doubt that we find ourselves currently within. Exile is the eternal homesickness that we all feel just beneath the surface, all of us trying to get back to Jerusalem. Here we sit with Israel and Babylon with 900 miles between us and home. How will we ever get back? In the early 90s, the city of Sarajevo was covered in ash and dust and fire as Serbia and Bosnia fought a brutal, long war. One day, 22 people were waiting for breakfast outside of a bakery when a mortar shell fell and killed them all and destroying the bakery that the city loved. Just down the street lived Sarajevo's chief violinist of the opera, his name Vedran. He lived just down the road and he heard the sounds of the shells hitting the ground. He didn't know what in the world he was supposed to do. He was not a soldier. He could not protect his friends and family. He was not a doctor who could bandage their wounds. He was not a politician. He could not write policy to help a ceasefire take place. So Vedran did what he could do best. He put on his nicest black suit, his white pressed shirt, black bow tie. He got out his most precious cello, the stool on which he had played countless concerts over the years, and he went and put that stool right in the middle of the crater where the shell had hit. And Vedran began to play cello. He played, and he played, and he played. For 22 days, Vedran played the cello. He didn't delete the sad verses, but he just kept on playing, one day for each soul that had been lost. As people would come up to Vedran in the coming years after the war was over, they would say to him, "We listened. We heard it all. We heard every note. That music, that was the joy that we needed. That was the joy that we could not find ourselves." Just when we are stuck in the midst of the rubble and the ash and the fire, the devastation and dismantling of exile, comes the God of Israel, who steps right into the middle of the mess of it all. And right at ground zero of our curse and sin and sorrow and thorn, begins to play a tune. Can you hear the song this morning? The wilderness, the dry land shall blossom with flowers. The speechless shall rejoice and sing. There shall be a highway in the desert. It shall be called the Holy Way, and the rescued shall walk there. The redeemed shall walk there. The weak hands shall be strengthened. Feeble knees shall be firmed. The mute shall sing for joy. The deaf ears unstopped. The rescued shall return home to Zion with singing and joy in their hearts, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. What an image. Sorrow and sighing shall flee away. I wonder what sorrow and sighing are being chased by in Isaiah's verses. Chased away by joy. The most important thing that we can know in our exile is that God is there with us. God is there with us. Mary, you shall give birth to your firstborn a son, and you shall give him the name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Almost brings me to tears to imagine God walking alone in the wilderness, just 100 yards behind his people as they walk away from Jerusalem. All 900 miles, every single step, God walking, following his people all the way to Babylon, all the way to exile, so far into exile that God would be born as an infant child who would taste and feel our dust and fire and sin and sorrow, all of it, every square inch of our exile. Most people in our world imagine that God is some old man up in the clouds, big beard, seated atop a golden throne who answers a prayer once in a while. But what of this image? What of Isaiah's God, who is thirsty and hungry, walking after us in the brutal wilderness, just so God can know the way back? Just so God can lead us home. The God who remains faithful in exile has found a way. Babylon no longer. Exile no longer. God, says Isaiah, is paving a highway. God is paving a highway through the wilderness, and all that was once barren will bud and blossom. It will become like the Garden of Eden. And as we walk, we will no longer hide from God, because God will put a song in our hearts. And not only us human beings will sing for joy, but the whole creation, the desert itself, will join us in the song. No more let sin and sorrows grow, nor thorns infest the ground. He comes to make his blessings flow far as the curse is found. Far as the curse is found. Friends, no matter how deep the hole is that you've gotten yourself into, no matter how covered our world is with ash and fire and dust, no matter how homeless and homesick we are as a people, no matter what your exile is at this very moment, our Advent God is with you, will never leave you, nor forsake you. Our God is coming. Our God is coming to take us home.